Hi. So in this video, I've gone through task 5, which asks you to look at the Gapminder graph and look at the GDP per capita and the life expectancy of those countries and learn how to read the graph and use the graph a little more. And I've also spent quite a bit of time looking at question 6, which asks you to compare the life expectancy and GDP of a particular country with the historical events of that country. So I find that question absolutely fascinating. I love working on that question. Love looking at what events in history actually cause geographical consequences. So the length of time that you're expected to live compared to things that are going on in that country, be it things like cyclones or war or political upheaval, can have a huge impact on how long you can be expected to live in a country and the amount of money that that country makes. So have a look through. If you want to skip through the first part, if you're comfortable with questions 1 to 5, which are basic sort of reading the graph, and I will include in the link below or in the description below at what point question 6 takes off. I have gone into quite a bit of detail with question 6. I've actually gone through an example of Mauritius and I've shown you how I would go about finding that information. So you might want to skip through parts of that, but I wanted to show you in depth about how I would actually answer that question and how I would go about finding the information. Okay, see you later. Okay, so on this page we're looking at the gross domestic product versus life expectancy. So the GDP is the total value of the goods and services that a country makes over a year. So how much money, I guess, in total the country is making. So that's GDP. When we look at GDP per capita, we're taking all that money and we're dividing it by the population, so we get a better idea about how much money the country is making and how much each person is getting out of that share. But of course we know that in most countries we have a section of really rich people and a section of really poor people. So the GDP per capita is sort of the average of that. So looking at this page, the questions down the bottom for task 5, there are 6 questions in total. So what I'm going to do in this video is simply go through each of those questions and show you how to find the answers using the Gapminder graph, which is this one here. So the first thing that you need to do is click on the Gapminder graph. And it will take you to this site, which you should be familiar with. Okay, now when we look at the graph, we can see that it's already set up with life expectancy at one side and GDP per capita down the bottom. Now, they are the factors that we actually need to look at for this section. So we're not going to change those at all. We're going to leave them how they are. Remember, if you hover your mouse over the individual countries, it will give you the names of the countries. And the size relates to, if we look down here, the size relates to the population total. So the larger the circle, the larger the population. And remember also that we can select individual countries by using this code down here. So first of all, if we click it, it will highlight that, and if you use this shading tool down here, we can make the other countries more or less obvious. So just a few things to remember before we start. Now the first question asks us about which country has the highest life expectancy. So up this side here of the graph, this is our life expectancy. So this is people are expected to live until 50. So there are a few countries that are below 50. So a couple of these African countries The average life expectancy is 48. Here it's 50 in Swaziland. The highest life expectancy, this is 90. And remembering once it's an average. So the country probably with the highest life expectancy is Japan with 83. China closely followed by 76. So that doesn't mean that as soon as you hit 76 you're going to die. It just means on average that's what you're expected to live to. But obviously there's going to be a group of people below that and a group of people above that. We can actually select Australia here, and our average life expectancy is 82. So we're quite high as well. But when we're looking for the highest, we have Japan at 83. So for the first question is which country has the highest life expectancy? We have Japan being the highest. And this is, remember that the graph changes over time, but this is in 2012. Just out of interest, if we move that graph along, we can see that in 1996, the country with the highest life expectancy was actually Japan, and China was a little bit lower. And you can see back here in 1960, the average life expectancy for China was down to 32, which is quite a dramatic drop from where we are now. Okay, the second question looks at the lowest GDP per capita. So we're looking at the country where the people have got the least amount of money per person in that country. So we have a scale here of $100 per person per capita up to $1 million over here. So by going along this direction, the first country that we come to is Somalia. And if you look down at the scale down here, it shows up that Somalia's average income per year is $614. And if we compare it to Australia, Australia's average income is $41,000 compared with $614 for Somalia. And if we track Somalia's progress, we can see that their average income really hasn't changed very much at all. So if we go back to 1821, their average income was $743. But if we have a look at Australia's average income and we go back to the 1800s, let's just play that through, we can see as Australia moves in this direction, it means that we're earning more money as a country. And you can see Somalia is staying in the same line, whereas Australia is gradually moving over towards a more financial situation. So we end up here, whereas Somalia has pretty much stayed. They've actually even dropped further. Just deselect all those. So the country with the lowest GDP per capita is Somalia. Now the country with the lowest life expectancy. Now we talked about the highest life expectancy being up here. So the lowest one we've already actually looked at. We looked at, now I've actually asked for 2012. So we need to just change the graph to 2012 by using the sliding scale. In 2012, the country with the lowest life expectancy, so using the scale along the side here, the lowest one is Lesotho, which is in South Africa, or Southern Africa. Remembering that the colour codes link with this map here. Okay, so question 4 asks you just for the figures for Australia. So the easiest way to do this is to go onto this column down the side and click on Australia and fade the other ones out. So in 2012, we need the life expectancy for Australia. And we can do that by hovering over the number, and we can see that these numbers are highlighted down here and down here. So the life expectancy in Australia in 2012 was 82, and the GDP per person was 42,450. Now the next question asks you to compare Australia with the United States. So if we scroll down, we can highlight the USA as well. Here we are. And if we compare them, we can see that Australia has a slightly higher life expectancy. So I'm looking at the life expectancy there at the moment. So Australia's life expectancy is 82, United States is 79. If we look at the income, we hover over the red. Australia's income is 42,000 and America's is slightly higher with 50,000. Excuse me. Okay, now the last question, let's just deselect all of these. The last question asks you to choose another country and to track its growth. So track its life expectancy and the amount of money it makes, and see whether we can come up with a reason why those changes have either occurred, or like in the case for Somalia, where changes haven't occurred at all. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to start playing it from, I'm going to slow it down, and you can slow it down using this little speed toggle here. So I'm going to press play, and I'm just going to have a quick look at the map to see whether there are any countries that sort of stand out for me that I think that I might want to have a look at. The other way that you can approach this is you might have a country in mind that you want to have a look at, so you can use that. Okay, so I've seen this little blue one here, which is Mauritius. And I've just had a bit of an eye on that one, and it's been dramatically drops down in the 1850s. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight that one, fade the others, and then I'm going to play from the beginning. I'm just going to watch the pattern of Mauritius. So nothing's happening in the early 1800s, and we can assume that's because there are no records. So the records start taking place in the 1830s. We have a drop down in the 1840s, another drop down in the 1850s, another drop down in the 1860s. So Mauritius seems to have this sort of really up and down life expectancy. The income, so the one along here, is staying the same, but our life expectancy is going from 4 up until 40. And then around 1940s, 1950s, suddenly people are living a lot longer, almost 20 years longer. And they continue to improve their life expectancy. Right up until 2013. So I find this really interesting to try and work out what was happening between 1801 and, when was it, 1843? Whoops. Now I've just got to find Mauritius again because I've lost the scale. Okay, so let's highlight that one. So let's see if we can pinpoint some actual dates and work out what's going on. Okay. So we find in 1801, we can assume that's when the records were taking place. 1840, we drop down to a life expectancy of 22. Okay, so how do I find out what happened in Mauritius in 1842? Okay. I'll just show you, I haven't actually done this yet. This is a new country, so I'm just going to show you the process that I will go through when I want to actually find out about this. So I'm just going to do a bit of a Google search for Mauritius, and I'm actually going to have a look at Wikipedia. Wikipedia often has quite a basic history, and that will probably tell us what we need to know. Now, the other thing I'll just point out to you, and I'm sort of skimming through this page because I'm looking for something in the languages. Okay, so on Wikipedia, you'll see, and I actually had a student point this out to me because I didn't realise, you'll see down the sidebar there are languages. Now, there's actually one called Simple English. If we click that, what it does is it does simplify the information that's on Wikipedia, because often the information on Wikipedia, particularly the information about countries and historical events, is often quite complicated and confusing and uses words that are often hard to understand. So the Simple English breaks it down, makes it a lot more easier to understand, and solves a lot of those problems about actually just trying to read the information. Now, if we have a look at the history, there's not a huge history section here, but I reckon there's going to be enough there to give us what we need. So we've got that it was settled by the Dutch up until 1712. That's not on our graph. Later by the French in 1810. Now, the British captured the island in 1810. So I'm just going to make a note of that. So in 1810, we had the British taking over. And it became a British Navy base. Now, I would think that that would maybe improve the life expectancy, but we'll have a look at that. So that was in the 1810. Now, 1968. Oh, now hang on. If we have a look here, it became an important role during World War II for submarine and convoy operations. So World War II was in the 1940s. So I'm just going to write down that it was a Navy base, the 1940s. And 1968, it became independent. So I'm just writing these down because I want to transfer those dates over to the graph and see whether that affected the population and the life expectancy of those people. Now I'm just having a look to see whether there is any other information on there. I can't see anything more on there. So I might just have another quick, because obviously we've looked at Wikipedia. I just want to go to another source, because once again we know that Wikipedia, even though it's really good for some basic information, Wikipedia is a crowdsourced encyclopedia, which means that the stuff on there may not necessarily be true. So let's go to another source of information and see whether we can find out. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to write history in the search so that I can narrow down and get away from all those tourist-based sites. Okay, so we have a Mauritius timeline by the BBC News. So also looking at who produces the website can give you an indication about how authentic and how much you should believe the website. So now this provides us with a lot more information about that. So let's just click back to the graph. Our records pretty much take off from 1801. Okay, so let's have a look down this timeline and see if there's anything there which might indicate a change in how long people are living. So I'm actually going to add that to my own timeline that I've started taking notes from before. So we have in 1834 the abolishment of slavery. So would that affect how long people live? We have workers arriving from India in 1835. So we would have a larger population. So I'm going to write that down. Okay, stamps probably aren't that relevant. This is interesting. 1866 to 1618, we have a malaria epidemic. So obviously that is going to have a huge impact on the life expectancy because people will be dying from malaria. So that was in 1868. We have a few other things that probably don't affect. 1937, we have some riots. We have independence. I'm looking for points in the timeline that might affect how long people live. See, we can see here. Oops. There's a cyclone in 1960. We have some rioting in 64. And 1966, it looks like we have some refugees being sent to Mauritius. Okay, we've got more jobs. It looks like the country becomes a lot more settled. 1979, we have another cyclone. Drug scandal, stock exchange. Okay, and then 1994, we have another cyclone. Now we can already see, if you remember in the graph when I first showed it, we had those dips of up and down, up and down, up and down. And already I can see there's a cyclone, then you have a couple of years where okay, and then the cyclone again, a few more years, cyclone again. So already just from reading the timeline, I can visualize that graph and see what's going on with it. Okay, a few more political ones. Okay, and I think we'll probably And I'm just looking to see if there are any more signs, because I remember when I was looking at the graph that sort of after the 1980s, things tended to settle down and we didn't have those dips. So I'm not expecting a big change in the life expectancy. Okay, so now I've got that timeline which shows me these different dates. So let's see if we can compare it. So one of the big dips was in 1842. 1842. Don't actually have anything for 1842. I can't see the connection. Let's have a look. So 1834 was when they abolished slavery. So that could account for a drop. And then it goes 1843. We had a really big drop. Was that 1843? 1844. Which is interesting because I've got no records, nothing on the timeline that indicated why there was that drop in 1844. 1854. 1860 was when we had the malaria. So we had another, yep, if we go to 1860, to 68. Yep. So we can definitely see that drop as a malaria epidemic hit. So that was 1866 to 1868, and then it starts going back up again after 1868. What was another date that we had? The cyclones weren't until the 1876, 1880. They're pretty stable. Let's see if we can find another. Here we are. So the other big drop was in 1919. 1919. I can't see any major events happening in 1919. 1920. But of course, if we think about something that wasn't on the timeline, the major events that were happening around 1915 to 1919, we know that it was mainly a British base. So there's a world event that happened around that time, which was, of course, World War I. So even though that wasn't on our individual timeline, we can assume that that had an impact in the 1900s on the population and how long people lived. So 1920s, we had a dip in 1930. 1930 were when there were some riots. Then we go back up again. Pretty steady. 1940s. We had a bit of a dip in 1945, remembering that was when World War II was on. Things improved after that. I think we pretty much stabilised after 1970s. So even though we had those cyclones, they weren't actually responsible for a lot of these dips. So we had a dip in 1967, which was the malaria one. A dip in 1854, which I can't seem to contribute to anything. I can't find any records of that. We had the dip for World War I. 1930s, we had some riots. And then we had a dip here, which, oops. Let's go back to Mauritius. Oh no, I have to play it from the beginning. No, play it from the beginning. Faster. Okay, so we had this dip here. Oh, it's not letting me highlight anything now. Which, let me see if I can go back to that date. Yep, so that one sort of coincides with World War One. So you've got World War One, World War Two, sorry, World War One, World War Two, one in between, which coincided with some political upheaval. Okay, keep doing this all the time. Let's play through it. So there are those few earlier ones, few earlier dates. It's actually quite difficult to find some information on why we had these earlier dips. So what I'm going to do now is, because I can't find it on the timeline that I've actually got this. So we've got one major dip in 1855. So I'm just going backwards and forwards to actually pin down. So 1856. So now that I've actually got a specific date, let's go back over that timeline. 1856. So we've got some political stuff, some self-government. Nothing that I would think. So let's just do a search now for Mauritius 1855. Shall we change that to 56? And see if we can come up now. This has just turned up. And it talks about cholera, which was another huge disease. So this is actually from the Trove, which is the National Library. And it talks about the Mauritius papers. Now, I'm only sort of assuming here that the Mauritius paper is a newspaper from the Mauritius. And it talks about cholera raging in the country after the arrival on a ship. Okay, up to the 19th of April, the deaths from cholera amounted to 1305, 1895. There'd been 350 deaths from the same cause in the district. So I reckon we can safely assume that this dip was due to that cholera. Now, there was another dip which I wasn't able, this one here. So 1868. Now, it could be the same. So let's once again do a search for 1868. Okay. Once again, we have our National Library site here. We have a hurricane. And that sounds like a pretty good reason for a drop in the life expectancy. Okay. So, because not only after things like a hurricane or a cyclone, not only do you have the actual immediate deaths and injuries which result in death from that cyclone or hurricane, but then you also have the damage to food stocks, the damage to medical supplies, and transport routes. So there is a flow-on effect of those that can then cause a drop in the life expectancy afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to end it there, but when you actually write up your comparison, what you're doing is writing down just what I've been talking about there. So you're actually looking through step by step at your graph for whichever country you decide to do and tying it in with events of the time. So you will have to look around Google a little bit more. As we discovered, it's often good to get a general timeline for your area and then see whether you can actually narrow down the specific dates which may not be on the timeline. So just out of interest, to give you some more ideas, we'll have a look at, let's have a look at Mexico and follow that timeline. So once again, we've got to wait for the data to kick in. So it looks right in the 1850s, we actually started getting recordable data about Mexico. Life expectancy is pretty stable. It drops subtly there in the 1915, 1920. Continues to rise. And stays pretty stable. So for something like Mexico, we've got one dramatic drop here in life expectancy. Now, the other thing, I've actually talked about life expectancy when I did Mauritius, but you can actually look at the income as well. Let's have another look at another country at random. Let's go for Togo. Okay, so once again, nothing much happening in the 1800s. That's primarily, whoa, because of the records. Something rather dramatic happened then. Okay, so our life expectancy is pretty consistent, as in consistently rising, apart from this date here, 1918. But what's really interesting is the economy. So the amount of money the country makes starts off improving, but then falls back. Now, the other thing I'll just point out is that you have this map feature. So if you don't know where Togo is, or any of these countries are, you can click on that map feature. Let's just deselect all. And it will show you where those countries are. And I don't think this is going to work on the map. But if we go back to the chart, once again, Togo had this drop in 1918 and then pretty standard growth in life expectancy. Oops. Let's try Azerbaijan. So you can have a play around with some of the countries. Some of the smaller countries often have more interesting paths to them than your larger Western countries, like Azerbaijan, which is kind of all over the shop. And it's graphs like that I just find absolutely fascinating to sort of think about what is causing this such an erratic growth in their income and the changes in their life expectancy. Because if we compare that to something like Australia, and we can play both of them back, we can see that Australia has a pretty standard growth in both life expectancy and income. So we're pretty much sort of heading in this diagonal direction. And like I said, if you compare it to Azerbaijan, it's really quite a dramatic difference. And Azerbaijan, let's have a look at the map, is here in the Middle East. Okay, so there we have a outline of all those questions from task 5. Obviously, the question 6 is the one that you need to put the more detail in because you are looking in the individual graph, and I want you to make those comparisons between what you see on the graph and what you see in history, and the events behind what's happening on that graph. Okay? Have fun.